Hey, and welcome to episode 4. This episode is about concert photography camera settings, I guess about the way that I work at a gig and how I approach it. There is no one set of concert photography camera settings that are right or wrong, but this is, I guess, the best I can do in trying to explain what my process is. The key questions they get asked, first of all, is what mode do I shoot in? Well, I shoot in manual entirely. But as regards the actual settings that I go to, there's a lot of kind of context involved in that. It might be you have to think about the band and the artist. You know, are they fast moving? Are they slow? Are they kind of slow moving band where maybe a singer-songwriter sitting on a stool with a guitar for the whole gig, or are they going to be headbanging, jumping off drum kits? So that has an effect on your settings, and probably has an effect on the lighting that's been designed by the production designer as well. But I shoot a manual mainly because I like the complete control of it. The complete control gives you room for creativity. I know most of you watching this probably already shoot fully manual, but for those that you don't, it's certainly not the big scary thing that I remember thinking of it as back in the day. I'm going to just run through the other settings, and I'm not saying that they're never appropriate to use. I'm just saying that I guess why I don't use them as my main modes. So many of you probably have heard of TV on the wheel on your camera, or our shutter priority. Essentially, you're setting here the shutter that you want to use for your camera, and you're letting your camera decide the aperture and potentially decide the ISO, depending on how you have your camera set up. Now, this is all well and good, but at the end of the day, having your camera make critical decisions without your control over them in a concert situation can be very risky. If you are, for instance, are set to 1/200th of a second for your shutter speed, and suddenly you happen to catch a very bright flary light that causes the camera to choose a much deeper aperture than you would have chosen, or a much lower ISO than you would have chosen, and you end up with a very underexposed image overall, except for this one light that it metered off. Aperture priority, or AV as it often is written on a camera mode wheel, it's a similar issue. Except you're choosing your aperture, obviously, that you want to use, and your camera decides the shutter speed and potentially the ISO as well. That, in exactly the same reason, although it can be handy, it can lead to unpredictable results with lighting in a concert environment. But also, that level of unpredictability and not having direct control over what it's going to do does remove a little bit of creativity from you. And although it's great when you're easing into manual control of your camera, your destination should be to get to fully manual control, in my opinion. I remember being scared of going fully manual back in the day when I was shooting weddings, and shortly after I shot my first couple of weddings, I did go fully manual. But at the end of the day, with a concert, you're very often shooting wide open anyway, especially in lowly lit venues. So you're really only balancing the shutter and the ISO for the settings that you're changing frequently. And your shutter speed anyway might be fairly steady anyway, because you might be making sure that if you're on a 50mm lens, you might be shooting at 160th of a second or faster for most of it. So really the only thing you're dealing with is your ISO on a regular basis. So manual doesn't have to be crazy all the time. It can be something that's very freeing, because when you need to, you can make an instant decision, whether that be to widen your aperture, increase your ISO, or lower your shutter speed. A lot of that, like we said earlier, it's dependent on the artist, depending on whether it's Ennio Morricone conducting an orchestra, or it's somebody going nuts hanging off the ceiling. Those are two different types of artists. Though I would like to see, Ennio Morricone like jumping off a drum kit in the air. That would be pretty amazing. Though I don't think he's done that. I don't think he's going to do that anytime soon. Finally, as regards creative choices with my ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, I find if I'm on a 50mm lens, kind of the slowest I can go without having to kind of shake is 1/60th of a second. But you have to bear in mind that your subjects that you're shooting are moving as well. If I'm on a 50mm, I like to certainly be at a minimum of 1/60th if I'm looking to try and freeze the motion. And obviously that goes up for longer focal lengths. That might be 1/250th if I'm on a 70-200, and it'll go up towards the 1/320th, for instance, if I'm at the 200mm. There are exceptions though. You know, you might be shooting a bass player who's standing there very statuesque, as lots of bass players do, and you have the option to, you know, slow shutter speed right down to 1/100th or less, and you still have them still, but you have the motion blur of their hands on the strings of the guitar, and that can add a lot of energy to a shot. There are also considerations with shutter speed sometimes with poor quality LED lights, where if you shoot too high a shutter speed, you end up with horrible banding, depending on the quality of the lighting that's in a given venue. And you know, you don't always know about that going into it. You just have to be prepared to react for it. Aperture wise, you know, very often, like I said earlier, very often shooting wide open because you just need all the light you can get. If you have enough light and you can purposefully choose to get a much greater depth of field, it can be handy for getting all band members in focus, like I mentioned in a previous video, for if you're going for a tour poster, for instance. But you know, a lot of the time, really, if you're on prime lenses especially, shooting wide open can be fabulous. But you just need to, like I said before, you need to really know your limitations of your lenses, if your lenses are sharp at their widest apertures or not. And ISO, this is the one that I know I battled with for the longest time. I used to hate noise so much, and I was always afraid to go too high with the ISO, and then I ended up having to push the shadows excessively in Lightroom. I have finally learned that I just go however high I need to. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't go up to like 20K type area, but I have realized that, you know, I can quite easily go up towards the 10,000 and deal with the noise quite easily after. Apart from the fact that with modern cameras, it's not so bad at that level. There is so much can be done with interesting techniques to remove noise, whether it be for the built-in functions in Lightroom or Capture One or Topaz products, for example, but also whether it be custom techniques like layering pictures and doing different levels of noise reduction and then merging those two stills. Again, that's a topic for another video, which I'm happy to go into. But noise is not the thing that I'm not afraid of it the way I used to be. I mean, you obviously always have options like converting to black and white, but it's amazing how often an image which looks horrendously noisy, when it's scaled down to the size you want it for a Facebook post, or when it's printed out, how often it looks way better than you thought that it did. The next setting, I guess, that I have my camera set up is I tend to use center point autofocus for when I'm autofocusing. I like the ability just to pick on an element, focus on it, and recompose the frame. It's something I got used to many, many years ago. Obviously, back button focus can help with that as well. You're moving your actual focusing onto a separate button in the back of the camera, so that you're not having to half press on your shutter button. That can be quite handy as well. I'm not a big fan of kind of having an array of points that the camera will choose from. Obviously, you know, depending on newer cameras, obviously, and on my Sony a7R4 and a7R3, you do have very, very good, I guess, zone control where, you know, you can define zones where it'll pick from. But I still personally love the center point mode. The exceptions to that for me are IAF, which on the a7R4, and I know there is competing technologies which do the same job on the Canon and Nikon. But I love the fact that with the IAF, how it just tracks the eyes of the subject. And that is very handy in the pit because it can stop you from getting the microphone in focus instead of the person's face. So that's a feature that I would use quite a bit when I'm not using the center point. Equally, tracking functions can be quite handy as well, where I have my camera set up that if I am using object tracking or face tracking of an individual, I have it set that I start off in the center point, and then if they move off, that it keeps following them as I'm held down on the shutter button. And that can be very handy as well. I also love manual focus. Again, I love the creativity of it. The focus peaking I find extremely useful. Though I do recommend having, if possible, one of your custom buttons set up to change the color of the focus peaking so that you're not suddenly relying on red peaking against a red background, because that can be confusing. But focus, I adore vintage lenses, by the way, and I have like a few Helios Russian lenses and old Minolta lenses. We've got adapters for these off Amazon quite easily. And the focus peaking is kind of like an upgrade for these old lenses, which makes them vastly more usable than they would be without it, you know, obviously with no autofocus on this gear. The next setting to talk about is white balance. Now, I actually do leave that on auto. I kind of pick my battles on what I'm going to attempt to do in a given gig and what I'm going to just not going to attempt to do. And the beauty of white balance with shooting in RAW is that you can change it after. I'm quite happy to do that rather than missing opportunities during a gig by trying to get the white balance right, particularly when you might have a lot of competing lights with different white balances anyway, so it just doesn't feel like it's a battle worth doing in the gig. As regards whether I shoot single shot or burst, again, that's relative to the artist, obviously. Whether if they're an artist that's going to be doing a lot more energetic things, then burst can be great. Or if they're going to firing confetti cannons, again, you want burst for the moments like that, which are just really fast and really dramatic, and you're wanting to freeze the moment. Yeah, so there you go. That is a kind of a quick, kind of 10-minute-ish overview of the settings I use at a gig. Try to keep this quick fire and not drone on and on for people, but I would appreciate you stick any questions you want in the comments. Hopefully it's been of some use, and you can follow me on Shoot the Sound, as you should see on screen now. There are some Lightroom presets in the comments, which I've had there for a few weeks now, free for anyone who wants. And yeah, I will see you soon for episode 5. Thank you very much.